course, the private citizen should have the rights, and the federal government, this isn't a personal call. This isn't one in which you should expect to be able to say whatever you want. These are not private. These are public conversations. These are public investigations, and the public should have a right to protect itself, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from California reserves. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Let me say I yield myself such times I may be consumed. The gentleman is inaccurate. And the fact is that when the bill came in, at first we did apparently have certain exceptions for law enforcement consistent with these concerns. That's not in the bill. As a matter of fact, just today, July 31st, 2013, we have a letter from the Federal Bureau of Investigation Agent Association, which says in part, H.R. 2711, and talking about the bill that's on the floor right now, 2711 creates a broad right to record conversations with federal employees and requires that the notices of the right to record conversations be provided to individuals engaged in discussion with federal employees without any exceptions related to criminal investigations. This proposal risks undermining criminal investigations by reducing the willingness of individuals to cooperate with law enforcement and would result in the creation of recordings of law enforcement conversations that could jeopardize sensitive and important criminal and counterterrorism investigations. That's from the Federal Bureau of Investigation Agents Association. I want to yield now 2 minutes to the distinguished member of the committee, the congressman from the great state of Missouri, Lacy Clay.
And I thank the
gentleman's recognized for 2 minutes.
I rise today in opposition to the bill also, and this bill would compromise the privacy rights of federal employees, and it would negatively impact law enforcement. The bill would assume that every federal employee consents to having any conversation recorded as long as they are acting in an official capacity. The bill contains no exceptions for law enforcement or military personnel. This bill is opposed by the National Association of Assistant U.S. Attorneys, and also in their letter they said passage of this legislation as approved by the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform on July 24 will disserve the dedicated and brave public servants in United States Attorney's offices and law enforcement who work tirelessly to pursue justice on behalf of the United States. The National Treasury Employees Union also wrote in opposition to this bill, and they said H.R. 2711 provides that every official interaction by any executive branch employee, whether by telephone or in person, shall be allowed to be recorded by the other party. And in certain circumstances, these executive branch employees must notify the other party of their right to record or be subject to appropriate disciplinary action. No exceptions are made in the bill for law enforcement or other sensitive communications. The Oversight Committee did not hold a single hearing on this bill. The bill was rushed through just to get it on the floor this week in time to fit the House leadership's message agenda. This is irresponsible legislating and should be defeated. I urge my colleagues to vote no, and Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Maryland reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now ask to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, a longtime businessman and someone who knows firsthand about abusive governments, Mr. Kelly.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the Chairman and Mr. Speaker. Listen, I rise in strong support of 2711. Let me tell you why. Now, I hear about protecting rights all the time and how important it is for the government to be able to do the things that they need to do. Let me tell you what it's like as a private citizen to be sitting in your office and getting a phone call from somebody saying, listen, I'm sitting here in Detroit, I'm recording this, and I have a lawyer sitting beside me because we're going to put you out of business today. And my response was, you know what, give me a little bit of time. Let me go get my lawyer. Let me get a tape recorder and tape what you're saying to me. Now, what's right anymore? Boy, have we confused things as, is this a government that works for the people or people that work for the government? My goodness, have we gotten things out of focus here. We think we are so powerful, we are so intelligent, we have reached a level of arrogance that is unbelievable to the American people. Why do they no longer trust us? Oh, I can record you, but you can't record me. Oh, I can have a whole list of everything that you've done, but God help you if you ever try to look into what I'm doing to you. Baloney. It's time for it to stop. Now, if we're really going to restore trust in this government, then it's going to take both of us, both sides. This is not a Republican or a Democrat issue. This is an American issue. My goodness, how could we be so far from what the founders envisioned when they had absolutely nothing to work for, nothing to work with, nothing but the providence in the hand of God in helping to form a government that is absolutely phenomenal. And then we're sitting here today and we're saying this, no, it's not okay for a private citizen to record what the government is saying to them. Now, the government can do just the opposite if it's really about what's right. And I don't want to get mixed up with what's legal, because we all know that what's legal has nothing to do with what's right. We've seen that too many times. We've watched it push back and forth. And while it may be funny to some, I got to tell you, it may be funny when you sit here. I would love you to meet me in the private sector and get a phone call from somebody from the government. It is truly not just chilling, it is freezing. You have got to sit back and listen to these folks, and they're recording every single thing you say. God help you if you stumble or stutter. That's what they're looking for. This gives the private citizen the same rights that they should have. This is a government that's supposed to work for the people and not the people working for the government.
Gentleman's
it's time to
expired.
restore trust in this government, and I thank you.
Gentleman from California reserved. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
I yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Hoyer.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I'm going to only speak once. There's 7 bills. Time is short. We have just a few days left in the legislature until we shut down government if we don't act. We passed 3 out of the appropriation bills that we're supposed to pass. And my understanding that the one we've had under consideration is not going to be brought to a final passage. I may be incorrect in that, but that's the understanding. At least there's some talk about that. This Congress has been the worst Congress for federal employees which I've served. The gentleman who spoke before me says he ran a business. If you treated your employees as we're treating our employees, they would have all quit. They would have all walked out. They would have said that the epithets that are used, bureaucrats spit out as a pejorative term for the people who make this government run. I don't know whether the gentleman read in the paper today, but 2 of our largest financial institutions fined very heavily for misconduct. Do people do things wrong? They do. They do them wrong in the private sector. They do them wrong from time to time in the public sector. Should we be concerned about that? We should be. Should we exercise that kind of behavior from the private and public sectors? Absolutely. But I will tell you that these bills, and some of them are okay, they're somewhat redundant. The bill the gentleman speaks of, I just got on the floor when he was speaking, so I don't know exactly what the circumstances are in terms of his being, obviously from his perspective, threatened by the fact that somebody was going to record. I understand his concern about that. I understand his concern about it as well. Frankly, if they'd called me and done that, I would have said, very frankly, I'm going to hang up and I'll talk to you later with my lawyer. And you're welcome to meet with me. I'm a lawyer, so I would have advised you to do that. But that does not explain the torrent of anti-government workers that we have seen from this Congress. and, frankly, to some degree from the last Congress. Now, they can't strike. And because they have to support their families, they can't walk out. They don't have many tools. They have us, of course, who represent many of them, to stand up for their rights, but much more importantly, for respect from their employer, which they're not getting. I would ask my friend if he can come with me, and I was down at Pax River, a big naval base, about the 20% cut that we've asked people to pay. They perceive because of our dysfunction, because we can't get our job done here. Not because of anything they did wrong, not because of a lack of a performance. And I will tell my friend, Mr. Kelly, that an awful lot of my folks are saying, we want to be in work. We've got guys at the point of the spear relying on us, and we're not able to work on Fridays. But they're still fighting on Fridays. They're still at risk on Fridays. And so when they see these bills, I tell my friend, it's a gotcha reaction they have. We'll get them. You didn't like being recorded. So your response is to do what you didn't like to them. Now, my response with them, if I were them, would say, sorry, Mr. Kelly, I can't talk to you. You're going to record me? I'm not going to talk to you. We'll write it and we'll put it down in paper. We'll do whatever. But as you were concerned about that effort, understand they're concerned as well. Now, as I said, some of these bills, there's 7 of them, or 8 of them. 4 more aren't too bad. 3 of them, obviously, going at undermining due process. The gentleman talks about being concerned. One of the bills on this says no due process. You're fired because I think you did something wrong. Not because I proved you did something wrong. Not because maybe you did do something wrong, but because I think you did something wrong. You're off, and you're off with no pay. You're off with no pay. So we have a series of bills here. Maybe the gentleman's asking Mr. Issa whether, in fact, that's one of the bills, but I assure him it is. So, Mr. Speaker, I suggest, am I out of time?
Gentleman's time has expired.
I have 1 additional minute.
Give the gentleman 1 minute.
Gentleman's recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I would suggest we're the employer, we're the board of directors. And yes, if we see somebody doing something wrong, and I think, frankly, in the IRS case, we haven't proved that yet, a lot of assertions, but not much proof, that we don't go head over heels denigrating those folks on whom we rely to carry out the very policies we adopt. Do we need oversight? Of course. Do we need honesty in performance of public duties? Absolutely. But we also need respect and consideration shown for those who work for America. The best civil service in the world, the most competent, best educated civil service in the world, and we treat them as second-rate citizens. We ought not to do that. We ought to reject this bill, certainly the Jenkins bill, and a number of others of these bills. Let us think of our federal employees. Because if we don't, we won't have the kind of government that America deserves and wants. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from California.
I yield myself 10 seconds simply to say, you know, if 2 people take the fifth when asked about their official conduct and there isn't a scandal, I'd be surprised to find that the gentleman from Maryland would find a scandal no matter what we find there. My 10 seconds has expired.
I didn't think you would.
Pardon me?
I didn't think you would.
I'd ask an additional 10 seconds and yield to the gentleman.
I thank the gentleman. Her lawyer, or the lawyers, because there was a criminal investigation underway, did what lawyers do, an abundance of caution. That, by the way, is provided for in the Constitution of the United States. I know the gentleman's read it. I've read it as well. So they were availing themselves of their
reclaiming my
constitutional
time.
rights.
Time has expired.
Reclaiming my time.
Gentleman's time has expired on the 10 seconds.
I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized for as much time as he wishes.
Thank you. The minority whip knows the Constitution. All of us have taken time to understand it. But when we investigate real wrongdoing like the IRS, wrongdoing that the American people understand, it was just wrong. Even the President started off agreeing with that. And then somehow, whether it's the IRS, Benghazi, Fast and Furious, or just somebody at the IRS putting a $500 million contract out to their buddy and then claiming that as they got him the contract that they didn't really know them well, somehow these become phony scandals. There's only one scandal in Washington, and that's when we find things that are wrong, we don't fix them. We don't have to worry about who at the top is in charge, but we have an obligation to fix them. And when people take the Fifth, when you're asking simply questions about their official conduct, yes, that's the beginning of a scandal here in Washington, and if not here in Washington, around the rest of America. And I'd ask to be able to yield 90 seconds to the gentleman from Texas to speak on the bill before us.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized for a minute and a half.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm troubled by the assertion that we don't treat our federal employees right because we're asking them to do their job correctly and give their employers, we the people, we the taxpayers, the authority to make sure they're doing their job right when they call us by recording it, by giving us as taxpayers and as citizens the opportunity to avoid a he says, she says when a federal agency who has the power to fine us or get us through all kinds of trouble calls us. We want to keep our evidence and we want to know. The gentleman on the other side of the aisle talks about private not treating the employees the same as the private sector. There are very few large companies I don't call. The first thing I hear is this call is going to be recorded for quality assurance purposes. Well, we're giving the power of the employers of the federal employees, the taxpayers, the power to record those calls for quality assurance purposes. Federal employees who are doing their job right, who are not intimidating taxpayers, have nothing to hide. We don't want to record their private conversations on their cell phones. We don't even want to get that metadata. We just want to record the data, or we just want to record what the federal employee is saying to us in the course and scope of his employ at our tax dollars' expense. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from California? Reserved. Gentleman from Maryland.
Mr. Speaker, may I inquire as to how much time each side has?
We have 7 minutes remaining.
The gentleman from Maryland has 7 minutes remaining. And the gentleman from California, 7.5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I yield myself 10 seconds. Just listening to the arguments, this is why, Mr. Speaker, it would have been quite helpful to have had a hearing on the bill so that we could flesh through some of these concerns. With that, I yield 2 minutes to my distinguished colleague, member of the committee, Mr. Connolly from the great state of Virginia.
The gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the Speaker, and I thank my friend and colleague from Maryland. I want to echo what the distinguished minority whip had to say. These bills were rushed to the floor. They've been long in planning on the Republican side of the aisle. They passed out of our committee on a party line vote. Hearings were not held. And little niceties like the fact that there wasn't a law enforcement exemption on this particular bill get overlooked in drafting when you rush to the floor like this. But of course, the purpose of these bills is not really to protect American citizens, though we could have done that. Because I would say to my friend from Pennsylvania, Mr. Kelly, I'm deeply sympathetic to the plight he found himself in, and I think we probably could have worked out a bipartisan set of proposals today that would have protected people like Mr. Kelly, now a member of Congress, and my friend from Pennsylvania. What he described is not acceptable, and we do need to protect people from it. But that's not the purpose of these bills today. The purpose of these bills is cynically political. It is to allow one side of the aisle, the majority, to go home and talk about an abusive government that they're standing up to. And in that narrative, you do terrible damage to the courageous men and women, the diligent men and women who serve our constituents, known as federal employees. It is part of a relentless and, I think, reckless and inexcusable attack on federal employees, on public servants, because it serves a political agenda. But the long-term cost is the disparagement of public service and the difficulty we are going to have in the out years in recruiting and retaining talent for the workforce of the future. And that's why I oppose these bills, because of the context. We could have made them better. We could have made them bipartisan. We could have actually worked together. But there was a cynical calculation not to do that, because the purpose of these bills is to continue to use federal employees as a political punching bag and to make some cheap, short-term political gains.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Maryland reserved. Gentleman from California.
I yield myself 15 seconds.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, there was only one amendment offered by the minority, and this bill passed unanimously on a voice vote. The gentleman on the other side could have asked for a recorded vote. If he objected to it, he did not. We are trying to give the 2 million men and women who are federal workers the right to record. I'll yield myself an additional 5 seconds. The right to record when they're called. This is a right every American gets, including the federal worker. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserved. Gentleman from Maryland.
Grant the gentleman from Massachusetts 2 minutes, Mr. Lynch.
The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the ranking member for yielding me this time. I rise in strong opposition to H.R. 2711, the so-called Citizen Empowerment Act that has been brought to this floor without a hearing. While I do understand that the legislation purports to address accountability and transparency in the federal government, I'm greatly concerned that H.R. 2711 in its current form will actually have quite the opposite effect. In particular, this bill would allow the recording of any telephonic or in-person conversation with a federal employee that is conducted in an official capacity. Regrettably, however, the bill does not include critical exemptions pertaining to the discussion of classified information or conversations relating to sensitive federal law enforcement or public safety investigations. In light of this significant flaw in the bill, our Federal Law Enforcement Officers Association has underscored that rather than enhance accountability in government, this bill would actually have a chilling effect on the ability of federal law enforcement officers to perform their duties. And according to the association, and I'll quote them, put simply, this legislation does not work in the context of federal law enforcement and does a disservice to the brave men and women who are asked to put their lives on the line to protect us from terrorists and criminals. For this same reason, the bill is also opposed by the National Association of Assistant United States Attorneys. Moreover, this legislation actually is evidence of a shift away from a greater transparency by failing to include a requirement that federal employees receive fair notice that their official conversations are being recorded. Importantly, 12 states, including my home state of Massachusetts, have enacted state laws requiring the consent of both parties to a conversation to give their consent. These states' efforts have been undertaken in the interest of government transparency, and regrettably this legislation would unfortunately serve to undermine them and preempt them. In addition, I would note that this bill would also serve to promulgate the severely misguided notion that our federal workforce is not to be trusted. Let us remember that our federal employees are dedicated public personnel who work at our veterans' hospitals.
Now it's for 45 seconds.
I thank the gentleman. Let us remember that our federal employees are dedicated public personnel. They work at our veterans' hospitals. I have 3 hospitals in my district. I know how hard they work. They protect our borders. They research cures and deadly diseases and provide key services in support of our Department of Defense, State, and Treasury. They deserve better than this, Mr. Chairman. They deserve better than this legislation. I hope my colleagues vote against it. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Maryland reserves, and the gentleman from Maryland has 2 minutes remaining. The gentleman from California is recognized and has 7 1/4 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume, and I read from the actual language as amended, the bill before us today, that says, notice of rights when federal employees engage in certain actions. And it says, A notice of an individual's right to record conversations with employees shall be included in any written material provided by an executive agency. Mr. Speaker, that's the only notice that's required in this bill, and that's simply, quite frankly, to let people know that it's a 50-state right, where today it's a 39-state right. I appreciate the fact that unions and associations representing federal employees have made statements. I just don't appreciate the fact that they've gotten the details of the actual bill wrong, and knowingly wrong based on the dates of their letter. More importantly, let's understand, this bill does not require verbal notice of a right to record given by federal officials. It does not compromise that. And more importantly, in 39 states, the public has this right, and in the other states, in most cases, the worst that would happen would be if a person pulled it out, they might not be able to use it when trying to defend themselves. But most important, this bill does not override existing federal wiretap laws. And of course, if somebody's talking classified on an open telephone, yes, I'd like it recorded because I'd like them to be able to make the case that classified information is being inappropriately talked for. But it does not override the right to go into a classified session. But that better not be with the public generally. If you're discussing classified information, please understand that's a secure location. So I won't accept these canards, these false, just in a moment, these false statements as to what could happen, because it simply isn't in the four squares of the bill. And I'd yield to the gentleman shortly.
The gentleman misunderstands. The federal employee doesn't know what is going to come out of the caller's mouth next.
Right.
So classified information can come without notice.
Reclaiming my time, classified information said by a federal employee has an obligation to be said in a secure location. And of course, under the law, they can say no recording devices can be here in the secure location. But of course, you go into a classified briefing, one, because you're cleared, and two, you go there knowingly. So let's not accept these kinds of things. And let's understand, in 39 states, law enforcement is recording without the permission of the public. And more importantly, so is the IRS, the EPA, OSHA, Fish and Wildlife in many cases. Or they're simply taking notes and holding you accountable. Remember, in America, if you answer the IRS wrong over the phone, you might very well get a bill. And your only ability to appeal that bill is to the IRS. And you must pay that bill before you can then go to the courts. Let's understand, we're dealing in all kinds of agencies, and there are good people, lots of good people there. But on behalf of the 2 million Americans who work for the federal government, I want them to have the right to protect themselves by being able to have a right to record in all 50 states. And I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserved. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, as I close, let me say this, that Chairman has made some allegations that things were not true. And he's not, I guess he's not talking about us, but I guess he's talking about the Federal Bureau of Investigation Agents Association in a letter just today referring to what he just talked about. It says, and I further quote from this letter, July 31st, 2013, it says, also by requiring written notices under the threat of disciplinary action, H.R. 2711 would create new administrative and bureaucratic requirements for agents conducting investigations. The time and the resources available to agents are already stretched too thin, and new administrative burdens make it more difficult for agents to protect the public. That's from them. And by the way, the letters in the Association of Assistant U.S. Attorneys and the Federal Law Enforcement Officers Association, their opposition to this bill goes to the bill that is on the floor right now. So they have their concerns. Again, I wish that this was something that we could have had testimony so that we could hear from those law enforcement agencies so that we could come to some type of agreement with regard to their concerns, but we did not have that opportunity. With that, I will reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from California.
I further reserve.
Gentleman from Maryland. Gentleman from Maryland has 30 seconds remaining.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, I would, based upon the arguments that we've already made, I would urge members to vote against this legislation.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from California.
In closing, Mr. Speaker, we hold these truths to be self-evident. And one of them clearly is our right of free speech, another free association. But protecting from our government is what our Constitution's all about. Now, my Democratic friends want to talk about the good workers. But the ranking member knows well there are good workers and there are some that aren't good. There are workers who would never call and harass somebody, and there are people who have threatened Americans repeatedly, and we have whistleblowers and we have proof of that. We have wrongdoing. And when you get harassed by the government, or you simply want to make sure that you know what you said, you have the right to do it in 39 states. And you have the right to do it in your state, but you may or may not have the right to do it in the other state in which the federal agency is calling you from. And if you're a rancher, Fish and Wildlife, EPA, OSHA, these are not just names on a board. These are people who really affect your life and your liberty and your very commerce, your very ability to feed your family. Now, the minority whip talked about the federal workforce not having a choice except to keep working because they need the money and they can't strike. We're not going to that issue. In the vast majority of states, this is already the law. They don't need the federal government's approval to record. When we look at harmonizing how people in every state in the Union look to their government and expect their government to look to them, that's a solemn responsibility. We don't preempt states in any way, shape, or form. We simply make it clear that Americans have a relationship with their government that they can count on. And one of them is, if they get a harassing call from somebody who's out of line, or they're asked inappropriate questions, it won't be a he said, she said, he said. They'll have the ability to record it if they choose. And around here, we know that fact-based documentation and recordings have made a huge difference in finding out the truth about things that have happened. We also know that what people say is often discounted here, even when they're talking about horrific things that happen to them. If we didn't have documents, not coming very quickly and usually blacked out, about the IRS's abuse of Americans simply trying to teach the Constitution or in some other way assert their rights of free speech, if we didn't have any documentation, it would just be a he said, she said. It shouldn't be a he said, he said. It should be absolutely something where you have that right. I want all 2 million American federal workers. I want state workers. I want everyone to know that they have this ability. And yes, I want federal workers to have an understanding that when they send an email out on the government email system, they in fact are sending out a public document, and it's going to be discovered potentially and used, and they should be careful what they say or do because they represent us. They represent the American people. So, Mr. Speaker, this is a bill that didn't need a long set of hearings, and I suspect that the same groups would object to it no matter how many hearings we had about Americans' right to life and liberty, their ability to assert what people would consider to be inalienable rights. We're not talking about a complex issue. We're talking about the vast majority of states have one rule, a few have a different rule, and as to federal workers, we're making the statement that we, their government, have decided that the answer, if you're asked if you can record, is yes, and you don't even have to be asked. Mr. Speaker, I move this bill, and thank you for your consideration.
Gentleman yields back his time. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 2711 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the Chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative.
Ask for the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8, Rule 20, further proceedings on this motion will be postponed. What purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 313 as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 313, a bill to amend Title V, United States Code to institute spending limits and transparency requirements for federal conference and travel expenditures and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Meadows, and the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Cummings, each will control 20 minutes. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
And I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days within to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials on the bill under consideration.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last year, the public became aware of the now infamous GSA Las Vegas conference that cost taxpayers some $820,000. In the wake of that public outcry, the Office of Management and Budget issued a May 2012 memo outlining new policies and procedures for federal travel and conferences. In the memo, OMB told agency heads to reduce travel spending for fiscal year 2013 to 70% of the fiscal 2010 levels. Senior-level review was instituted for all events, with a senior-level approval and public reporting for events costing some $100,000 or more, and a general prohibition on events costing $500,000 or more unless the agency signed a waiver. The Oversight Committee learned that in fiscal year 2012 alone, nearly 900 federal conferences costing in excess of $100,000 were held. The total cost of these events exceeded $340 million. H.R. 313 codifies the OMB's travel and conference guidelines with some important changes. While exempting military travel, the bill eliminates loopholes in the OMB guidance in order to assure that agencies actually achieve a 70% reduction in non-military related travel. The bill also mandates transparency by requiring agencies to post online a quarterly basis detailed itemized reports of all conference spending. And it requires that materials presented at the conference by a federal employee be made available online. Last year, the House approved unanimously substantially similar legislation that was also reported from the Oversight Committee. I'd like to thank Mr. Farenthold for his leadership on this bill and Mr. Pocan for working with us at the committee markup to help make important improvements to this bill. I urge all members to support this good government and common sense legislation, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from North Carolina reserves his time. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Speaker, I yield myself such time as I consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
I rise in support of H.R. 313 as amended. I support the intent of this legislation to reduce wasteful and travel and conference spending and to shine light on the federal government's expenditures in these areas. The recent instances of excessive spending at a 2010 Las Vegas conference held by the General Services Administration and 2 2011 Orlando conferences hosted by the Veterans Affairs Department gave good cause for the introduction of this measure. I believe that the safeguards and heightened congressional and public scrutiny are needed to prevent incidents like those from happening again. This bill is similar to legislation that passed the House in the last Congress and similar to administration guidance issued to agencies. The legislation would require agencies to reduce travel spending by 30% below fiscal year 2010 levels, and in each of the next 5 fiscal years, and limit expenditures on any single conference to $500,000. Also thank Chairman Issa for working with us to make some changes to the bill to address some of our major concerns. We added language to the bill to allow agency heads or the Secretary of State to waive the 50-person limit on the number of employees who may attend international conferences. This change was made to address concerns raised by Representatives Rush Holt, Eddie Bernice Johnson, and others in the scientific community about the potential negative effect of the limit on the free and open exchange of scientific and technical knowledge. We also established a $10,000 as the minimum threshold amount a conference would have to cost before agencies would be required to provide cost information in their quarterly reporting. Lastly, we appreciate the addition of the language in the bill exempting travel expenses from the required 30% reduction when the reduction would undermine national security, international diplomacy, health and safety, inspection of law enforcement, or site visits required for oversight or investigations. I believe that H.R. 313 has been greatly improved by these changes. I offer my support for this legislation, and with that I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield as much time as he may consume to my distinguished colleague from the state of Texas, Mr. Farenthold.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized for as much time as he wishes to consume.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate the ranking member's support of this bill. This is not an anti-travel, anti-conference bill. This is a common-sense, transparency, and good government bill. It was designed to stop wasteful spending. You hear a lot of talk here around Washington, D.C. about we've got to stop the waste, fraud, and abuse. Well, we're doing that here today with H.R. 313. What we're doing is saying if there is a government conference, it needs to be for government purposes and real work needs to be done. We're not asking the taxpayers to foot the bill for a vacation for federal employees. We don't need clowns. We don't need mind readers. We don't need a Star Trek video. We don't need pictures of agency representatives in a bathtub with a glass of wine. We need federal employees conducting federal business and doing what the taxpayers are paying them to do. You know, many of these conferences are great opportunities for training, great opportunities in the scientific community to move forward with advancements. But what we've got to do is make sure taxpayers' money is not wasted, that it is spent wisely. We need a culture in this government where federal employees, each and every one of them, know it's not their money they're spending, it's the hard-working American taxpayers' money that they are spending. So that's what we're doing here today. We're putting limits on the amount that can be spent, and in certain cases you can go over these limits, but we need to have someone held accountable for these conferences. So when you get into the big dollar amounts, an agency head, somebody who's politically accountable, has to sign off for it, somebody who actually is thinking all the time about what's the public going to think about this. This is a great solution we've crafted in a bipartisan manner that doesn't end conferences but promotes responsible conferences. And I urge my colleagues to vote yes on H.R. 313 and yield back the remainder of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from North Carolina reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
I yield to the gentlelady, Ms. Titus, 3 minutes.
The gentlelady from Nevada is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the ranking member for the time. I would first respectfully correct the record because the GAO conference was not in Las Vegas. It was in Henderson, Nevada, which is in District 3. Now, like my colleagues, I believe that government agencies should spend every cent in the most careful and responsible way possible, and it's our job as members of Congress to ensure that all government spending is effective and efficient. While there are still improvements that can be made, and I agree with many of the comments that have been issued on the floor already, Congress and the administration have already taken many steps to eliminate excessive travel, require transparency, and improve oversight. I rise today, however, because I believe that H.R. 313 sends the wrong message about business travel. I'm proud to represent Las Vegas, one of the premier business destinations in the United States. Last year, we hosted some 21,000 meetings and conventions attended by almost 5 million business travelers. These business meetings supported 60,000 jobs with an economic impact of $6.7 billion. Business travel is an important aspect of the economy, with over $250 billion in direct spending by business travelers, which supports 2.2 million jobs nationwide. And even in this age of technology, where lots of business is conducted via the Internet, Small businesses across Nevada tell me all the time that the opportunity to meet face-to-face to discuss new programs, cultivate business at a trade show, or learn about new products and designs is just irreplaceable. So I look forward to continuing to work with my colleagues to cultivate this important aspect of our economy while also ensuring that our tax dollars are well spent. And I yield back my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from North Carolina.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Nevada.
Gentleman from Nevada is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of reining in excessive government spending and waste and thank my colleague from Texas for his work on this important matter. And as a representative who represents Henderson, Nevada, I'm pleased Congress and the administration work together to reduce wasteful government spending and prevent flagrant abuses of taxpayer funds on lavish conferences and travel. These efforts will certainly increase oversight and transparency. However, I urge my colleagues to avoid those unnecessary restrictions on government travel that could significantly affect conference cities like Las Vegas and Henderson. Despite the inexcusable actions of a few government conferences, can benefit the public and private sector and contribute to our economic health. Canceling conferences outright solves nothing. Cancellation of a 2013 Military Health System conference to train military medical personnel actually cost the government more than $800,000 in replacement expenses and lost revenue. I'm concerned that those approving government conferences under these new standards may limit agency travel to specific geographic locations solely to avoid the perception of the misuse of taxpayer funds. These decisions should not be about perception, but should be based on cost-effectiveness, efficiency, and the best interest of taxpayers. That's why I co-sponsored H.R. 1880, the Protect Resort Cities from Discrimination Act, to prohibit federal agencies from implementing policies that discourage travel to perceived resort or vacation destinations. Cities like Las Vegas, Henderson, Orlando are equipped with an abundance of affordable rooms and conference spaces, and independent studies confirm that per attendee cost of government conferences is nearly half that of similar private sector conferences. But these cities should not suffer from poor judgment by a handful of government workers. Again, I strongly support the efforts to eliminate the waste and abuse of taxpayer funds. Federal travel and conference participation benefits our economy when done appropriately and responsibly. So I support this legislation and ask to continue to work together to encourage accountability and transparency for government travel to ensure conference cities like Las Vegas, Henderson, and others can continue to provide their valuable services. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from North Carolina reserves. Gentleman from Maryland.
Mr. Speaker, I urge members to support the legislation, and with that I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to my distinguished colleague from the state of Florida, Mr. Ross.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of the Government Spending Accountability Act, which will rein in out-of-control government spending by providing much-needed reforms and transparency for federal employee travel and government-sponsored conferences. As someone who introduced similar legislation last year, I want to thank Chairman Farenthold for his continued work on this important issue. Mr. Speaker, reports of lavish and out-of-control spending by various federal agencies, most notably the General Services Administration, have highlighted the need for serious reform to these types of fiscally irresponsible practices. However, other agencies have been responsible for carelessly wasting taxpayer funds as well. One example of this waste took place an hour from my home in Lakeland, Florida. In 2011, the Department of Veterans Affairs held 2 human resource training conferences in Orlando, Florida at a cost of $6.1 million to taxpayers. Last year, an Inspector General report published within the Department of Veterans Affairs found that the department conference planners allowed up to $762,000 of unauthorized or wasteful spending. This included gifts, spa treatments, tickets for helicopter rides, and golf packages. Mr. Speaker, the men and women in uniform are some of the best and proudest that America has to offer. They take an oath to uphold not only the Constitution of this United States, but also to give the ultimate sacrifice of their lives. Here, the Veterans Administration agency that is charged with making sure that their benefits are adequately and appropriately provided has been indicted with wasting these taxpayer dollars. Unfortunately, at a time when veterans are waiting in line for benefits they fought and sacrificed to earn, taxpayers should not be subsidizing lavish hotel bills and golf outings. Once again, I want to thank the chairman for introducing this legislation and encourage all my colleagues to join me in passing this good government legislation. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the ranking member for his support of this legislation, and I urge all members to support the passage of H.R. 313 as amended, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. Both sides having yielded back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 313 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the Chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative. The rules are suspended. The bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. What purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 2579 as amended.
Clerk, report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar Number 134, H.R. 2579, a bill to amend Title V United States Code to provide for investigative leave requirements with respect to senior executive service employees and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Meadows, and the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Cummings, will each control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
I ask unanimous consent for all members to have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials on the bill under consideration.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. From Jeff Neely at the GSA to Lois Lerner at the IRS, the Oversight and Government Reform Committee has uncovered numerous examples of high-ranking government employees engaging in behavior contrary to the principles of public service. In the private sector, these behaviors would be grounds for serious disciplinary action or termination. In some cases, these employees could face civil or criminal penalties, but not in the federal bureaucracy. Only in Washington would these employees not be terminated, but instead be placed on administrative leave with pay. H.R. 2579 helps ensure senior executive service employees are held accountable for their actions while maintaining existing due process rights. This legislation was unanimously approved by the Oversight Committee last week, and a similar version of this bill was passed by the House by a vote of 402 to 2 last Congress. I want to commend Mr. Kelly for his work on this bill, and I urge all members to support its adoption. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from North Carolina reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm no longer surprised, but I am saddened that the Republicans are wasting the last few days before the August recess to vote on bills to repeal the Affordable Care Act for the 40th time and to continue their campaign to blame our country's civil servants for the challenges we face. We could be addressing the many serious and important issues facing our country, such as appointing conferees to negotiate a balanced budget to replace the harmful sequester, or passing legislation that would create jobs for the middle class, or voting on comprehensive immigration reform. Instead, Republicans are more interested in playing partisan games and advancing political messaging bills. Americans want Congress to focus on creating jobs and growing our economy. And Democrats have put forward a responsible budget that invests in the future and the middle class, while taking a balanced approach to deficit reduction. Yet, Republicans refuse to listen, with a record defined more by what they have failed to do than what they have actually achieved. It has been 209 days since the start of this Congress, and Republicans have failed to pass a single jobs bill. It has been 129 days since the Senate passed a budget. The Republicans have refused to appoint conferees to complete negotiations and resolve final legislation. Now, Senators John McCain, Susan Collins, Lamar Alexander, Bob Corker have joined House Democrats in our calls to go to conference. Yet, here we are today, debating on H.R. 2579, a bill that would strip due process protections from senior executive service employees accused of wrongdoing. The bill would give a politically appointed agency head broad discretion to fire senior executive service employees without advance notice. The bill would provide no opportunity for proper investigation or for employees to address the agency's concerns before such action is taken. And 2579 would eliminate due process protections that were put in place precisely to protect civil servants from partisan political influence. It would shift the burden onto employees to prove their innocence and seek reinstatement. This is contrary to the core legal principle of the American justice system, the presumption that one is innocent until proven guilty. My Republican colleagues would have you believe that this is a bill needed to hold senior executives in our federal government agencies accountable. Although abuses committed by government employees certainly need to be addressed, denying due process rights to employees is not the appropriate way to do it. There are existing procedures in place to deal with these challenges. Under current law, agencies may take action against senior executives for misconduct, neglect of duty, malfeasance, or failure to accept a reassignment or a transfer of function. However, current law requires agencies to give senior employees 30 days advance notice, among other rights, before disciplinary action is commenced, unless there is reasonable cause to believe that the employee has committed a crime. I believe that we need to strengthen and improve agency implementation of existing disciplinary procedures, rather than pass legislation that would abridge the fundamental rights of our public servants. The bill would fire accused employees first, then ask questions later. I'm afraid agencies' heads could feel undue pressure, in particularly high-profile cases, to terminate employees without first conducting a thorough investigation to determine the facts. For these reasons, I strongly oppose H.R. 2579, and I urge my colleagues to join me in opposing this legislation. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield as much time as he may consume to my distinguished colleague from the state of Pennsylvania, Mr. Kelly.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for as much time as he wishes to use.
And I thank you, Mr. Speaker. For those of you up in the gallery, please put on your seatbelts. Again, this room's spinning so fast right now, it's hard to determine what's being said or why it's even being said. So please, put them on. I don't want you to fall out of the gallery trying to keep up with what's being said.
The gentleman will suspend. The gentleman will suspend. Yes. You're advised to address to the chair all comments and not to people in the gallery.
Okay, I will then. My comments then, Mr. Chair, is I'm concerned about the safety of those watching today from the gallery, so I just wanted to be aware that there's a definite turntable here, and I'm really surprised that anybody can walk straight when they leave this room because of the spin that's put on everything. So my concern is for the safety of those watching today.
Recognized.
And I thank you. You know, back to February 6th, 1788, and James Madison said to us, if angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. Now, I got to tell you, Madison is still alive. And he's alive on both sides of the aisle. And what amazes me sometimes is how we get so far away from what it is that we're trying to do and who it is that we're trying to protect. Now, I've heard the terms that, you know what, we're not protecting those who work for America. Let me tell you about those who work for America. When I come out of my church on Sunday morning out of St. Paul's, the 8 o'clock Mass, I see all kind of people who work for America. When I'm down at the Kmart doing my shopping, I see all kind of people who work for America. When I'm in Erie, Pennsylvania, I see all kind of people who work for America. The same in Meadville, Pennsylvania, and the same in Butler, Pennsylvania. So I'm sometimes confused about who it is that we're trying to protect. And if it's truly those who work for America, it is those who work for America. All these folks behind me work for America. All the people at our homes work for America, do they not? Now the question is, who looks after those people, those American taxpayers? When there's an abuse, my goodness, have we gotten to the point where our only concern is for those who get a check that says it came from the United States government? I know who funds America. It is hard-working American taxpayers. That is why it's so unbelievable for me to sit here and listen to how we're not protecting those who work for America. This is not about the men and women, the guys and gals that go to work every day for the government. This is not stripping. Now, you know, the ranking member knows that this is not about stripping of their rights. It truly is not. In fact, if you go to page 8, lines 15 through 17, an employee against whom an action is taken under this section is entitled to appeal to the Merit Systems Protection Board under Section 7701 of this title. Nobody is being stripped of anything. What we're doing is taking care of all those people who elected us to come here. And I got to tell you, I wasn't just elected as a Republican to come and take care of only those folks in my district that are registered Republican. I was sent here to represent everybody. I've never ever sat back and said, you know what, this isn't in the best interest of my Republican constituents. It helps my Democrat constituents. So I think, you know what, since I'm a Republican, I'm going to try and game it. I'll spin it. So I can't protect it. I can't vote that way. That's absolutely stupid. And again, how far have we gotten from the initial message of what it is we're trying to do? The Government Employee Accountability Act. You know, when we had the GSA hearing, and the ranking member sat there, and I heard them say to me also, when I said, well, why is Mr. Neely on leave with pay when you know the IG had him under investigation? In fact, you bonused him money for the very same event that you are now investigated, he's being investigated for. You bonused him, and then you let him go home and do what he wants to do. He's on leave with pay. When I go back home, people ask me all the time, when I see their faces, I can't look at them and say, you know what you don't understand is that in Washington, you can do the wrong thing and there's no accountability. Now, if you're back home in the private sector and you do the wrong thing, you're held accountable. See, what you have to understand is you work in the private sector, not the public sector. And they cry out for equal treatment, not special treatment, not to be handled differently than anybody else, but say, you know what, Mr. Kelly, if it's good for the goose, it's good for the gander. Should we not, both sides of this aisle, be concerned with what's right for the American taxpayer? Should we not be concerned with what's right for American citizens? Should we not say to these same people who run these agencies, look, we know you don't have the tools that you need, and that's what I was told by the GSA. We put Mr. Neely on leave because we don't have any mechanism to do otherwise. Now, I don't want to keep beating up Jeff Neely, but by the same token, I refuse to keep beating up American taxpayers. If I don't have the stomach, if I don't have the backbone to do what's right, and if I can't walk a straight line when I leave here, this is not about taking the rights away from people who work for the government. Come on, guys, you know that. Oh, my goodness. You guys, we got to get together on this because it's not making sense to me. This looks like the back end of a frat party where everybody's kind of walking crooked coming out, trying to figure out what it is they did for the last 3 or 4 hours. I got to tell you, this is common sense for America. If we cannot protect those who sent us here, if we cannot restore the trust of those who sent us here, if we're to come here and debate and make a mockery and spin it to the point where it confuses the American people, this is not about taking anybody's rights away. This is about reinforcing the responsibilities of those who work for the American taxpayer, and that is all of us, both Republican and Democrat. Now, I got to tell you, I've said this before, there's no way I'll ever go back to Northwest Pennsylvania and tell them, you just don't get it. See, the problem with you people, you're so busy working, trying to make ends meet, you don't understand how government works. See, we can twist it, we can turn it, we can say anything we want, and what we ask you is to believe it. You know what the American people are telling us? I don't believe you anymore. I don't trust you anymore. I don't understand why I can be held accountable for everything I do, but other folks that work for me can do pretty much anything they want. And then we'll redeploy them. We'll push them off to another area. They won't lose a penny. And we'll bring them back in under some other title, some other agency. All I want to do is give those managers of those agencies the tools that they have requested of us in Congress. Give them the ability to hold people accountable. Now, who am I talking about? I'm talking about the senior executives. I'm not talking about every gal and guy who walks into an office every day that does great work for the American people. Let's not get confused. So please, don't spin it. My days of riding a merry-go-round are over, and so should yours. We can fix this, but we have to put things in there that make it possible to hold people accountable. The people that raised me, the people that I've worked for, the people that I have played under as coaches, hold you accountable for everything you do. And there are repercussions for doing the wrong thing. You don't give them a pat on the back and say, you know what, go home for a while. Don't worry about your pay. American taxpayers are going to pick up the tab on that. We'll keep you safe. We'll keep you covered. Senior executive. This is the creme de la creme. This is the top of the bunch. This isn't all those people you see walking in and out. I don't want to get it confused with the gentleman of Maryland about sequestration. This is about what's fair for this nation. And I'm sick and tired of having everybody else thrown in and say, no, no, you don't understand. But let's all put it in a blender, we'll pour it out, and they'll drink it. No, they won't. American people are choking now on the rhetoric that comes out of this House because we don't talk straight. We talk Washingtonese, which nobody understands. We wouldn't allow it in our public sector. We shouldn't allow it here. If it's about accountability, listen, I will tell you what. I would like to see accountability not just in the Government Employee Accountability Act, but also in members of this great legislation. My goodness, if we don't understand what Madison said, and we are truly not ruled by angels, we know that, we are obliged to put in elements that force us, because we won't do the right thing on our own, force us to do the right thing for the American taxpayers and those men and women who get up every day, throw their feet out over the bed and go to work. And you know why they do it? Because they love their families, they love their country, and they know they have to do it. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for allowing this piece of legislation to come forward. I can't tell you how proud I am to be a member of this body. We may disagree on some things, but people tell me, you know, Kelly, the problem is you don't understand. I said, no, no, no. The problem is I do understand. I just don't agree. I understand it so well that if we don't right these wrongs, this great, great country will never be what it was supposed to be. And for us to sit here as a body and allow it to happen and say, you know what, too tough a vote. Man, you know, some people are not going to like me for this. I may not get elected the next time. I just say, you know what, get a stomach, get a stronger back, and do what's right for America. This is about what's right for the true Americans that keep this great organization going, and that is the American taxpayer. So having said that, Mr. Chairman, I thank you so much for allowing me to get to speak. And please, if angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. Isn't it amazing that over 225 years ago, the same thing rings true today? If it were really angels that were running the organization, we wouldn't be having these conversations, and we would just go ahead with every day and think, it's all right. We're not. We're ruled by men. Men make mistakes. Men need to be held accountable when they make a mistake. And I want to make sure that each of us, no matter what party you represent, is able to go to a home district and say, I did what was right for you today. I did what was right for you, your children, your grandchildren. I did what was right for America. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. What purpose?